So I've been working on climate change and finance for some 15 years now. And I set up this particular organization, which is a global NGO work for green bonds, essentially, to pursue a theory of change. And the theory of change was around this idea that in democracies, we have politicians that are sandwiched between forces. We need to bring new forces of power to the table if we are to achieve change quickly, especially forces that might counter legacy interests. And when it came to energy, which is what I was looking at 15 years ago, that legacy interests were clearly fossil fuel companies and utilities with existing infrastructure didn't want to see change, understandably, from their perspective. The force that I thought was had potential to be brought to the table were asset owners and fund managers as a result of asset owners. To differentiate, asset owners are like the pension fund boards, fund managers are the Amundis and the Black Rocks of the world who invest the money on behalf of the asset owners. So I spent the first 5 or 6 years of this particular project just focused on working with asset owners. Many other colleagues have been doing the same thing as well. It's worked. They have now got to a stage where they are asking their fund managers to do X, Y, and Z around climate change. Invest in green bonds is one thing. Shareholder activism is another issue. Climate Action 100+, for example, and many other measures. Now, this doesn't mean that asset owners or fund managers or the market will lead to the change we need. On the contrary, back to my original point was that governments or politicians meet between the sandwich as a rule. We still need to get them to act. So bringing investors to the table as a force for change is about getting governments to act. We don't actually change things as quickly as we need to change them without strong state action. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean governments borrowing the whole money to pay for a change, although in 2020, that looked eminently possible given the scale of sovereign borrowings. But it does mean regulation, urban planning, energy planning, fiscally efficient measures to mobilize capital, as we're seeing but employed by the Commission, the European Commission at the moment, etc., very much need to be in the agenda and need to be pursued with alacrity. And that's where we're going, where we're ending up with this green bond market. I say that because green bonds, which is the instrument that I play with at the moment, about $101.1 trillion outstanding globally, is a means to an end, not an end. It gets the attention of everyone because you see big numbers, you see billions and billions. It gets the attention of governments who issue sovereign green bonds, as France and Germany have, and Italy's about to. It then gets the attention of departments or ministries within those institutions who are pressed by their treasuries to find more things to justify the green bonds. And then you start an internal dynamic. I remember once a friend of mine who was in the Ministry of Climate Change in Ireland said to me that he'd been trying to get a meeting about financing climate change with the Ministry of Finance for 5 years unsuccessfully. And then they phoned him up and they insisted he come to a committee meeting, and that committee meeting is meeting monthly, looking for climate projects because their sovereign green bond had been so successful that the Ministry of Finance and Treasury wanted to do a lot more of them. That's a little taste of what we try to do with the green bond market. We had a thought about how we would execute many years ago. There are many policy initiatives and so on. But in terms of commoditization of markets, in 2012, the Climate Bonds Initiative launched a certification scheme, which included a taxonomy of green investments with a rather unusual aspect to it. This was not based on relative best. This was not based on best in class, I guess, which is what you had seen in ESG ratings in the past. We linked it directly to the IPCC reports of what needed to be done, or particularly the science reports, not the mediated government report at the end. And we put out guidelines for, therefore, what should be considered climate-related investments. So that's the beginning of this journey I'm going to take you on today. I'm talking mainly about the EU Taxonomy, which is the fruit of some of that work. Of course, I'm happy to talk about green bonds and other countries as well, should that be of interest. I will mention China in passing. It is hard in a Zoom format to have a fully interactive session. My apologies for that. So do your best. Put something in the chat, of course, or just wave your hand and see if you can catch my attention. And then we'll get a bit of audio into the room. I need a bit of animation because here it's 3 a.m. in the morning, so I need help staying awake from you, please. Let me start up my PowerPoint. I will run through that. We'll see how that goes, whether that addresses questions and comments. But I'm keen to see whether you have other questions or reflections, which might take us off in related tangents. Open slather, as far as I'm concerned. First, let's see where this PowerPoint is. So this is largely a presentation that was done, that we created for the EU Taxonomy, or the platform, EU platform. So it's a little bit staid, I'm sorry to have to say, because the Commission had to sign off on it, so it makes it boring in parts. But let me see whether I can go. This wasn't signed off by the Commission, just so you know. The background to all of this has been the rapid growth of this market we've created in green bonds, and as I call it here, the daughters of the green bond market that use the same format, use of proceeds. It's a very simple idea, really. It's just say Arnold wants to buy a car and he goes to his uncle and says, lend me the money. And the uncle says, well, okay, I'll lend you the money, I trust you, but I want you to buy an electric car because I don't think you should buy petrol cars anymore. Hey, that's a green loan, close to a green bond. And Arnold says, I will go back and see you every Christmas and take you for a drive the electric car to show you that I still own it. And that's the reporting aspect of green bonds. Very simple, really. It's the simplicity that is behind its success. Anyone can issue a green bond, a government, a corporation, a development bank. All they're doing is promising to allocate the proceeds to something green. Of course, we come to what green is as part of our taxonomy conversation. About 20% of, maybe 15 to 20% of all the market are asset-backed issuance, largely from Fannie Mae in the US. That's the world's largest issuer of green bonds. They're passing on a slight discount in loans to multifamily homes, social housing, that improves the energy efficiency of buildings as a result of their green loan program. But the bulk of them, more than 80%, or about 80%, are full faith and credit bonds, that is corporate-backed or government-backed, where they're simply promising, like Arnold promising to his uncle, to allocate the money to a specific green project, but to take full responsibility for the loan. Bonds are largely a refinance instrument. So more than 50% of the bonds in the market are for refinancing. That is, financing of projects that have been built in the past. A solar farm that's 4 years old, for example. Or last year's energy efficiency tax credits by the French government. And that's perfectly reasonable, both for the market's perspective and from my perspective, because what we try to do is to encourage a refinancing which will free up equity and bank finance, which is the real driver of project finance. At a project level, people hardly ever use bonds. Bonds have a role in the capital stack. They free up capital by allowing it to be recycled. So for that reason, lots of refinancing. The ones that don't use refinancing effectively do. These are banks or development banks who are borrowing against their existing balance sheet to fund their next 2 years of loan work. So it's a little bit doubtful as to whether it is refinancing or not there in terms of the difference between credit and loans, but we're just semantics here. The market has been influenced strongly by the work we've done around a climate bonds taxonomy that I mentioned earlier. This has been an attempt to outline what are the kinds of investments that are relevant to addressing climate change. When I had a conversation some 7 years ago, I think now, with a sustainability manager of a leading American bank in New York, he said to me, climate change will only ever be a small part of green. It's like things like water and parks will be the big part. We'll get to a $100 billion market at some point. I turned around and said to him, you're wrong. You are totally wrong. There should not be an environmental investment made. There should not be an investment made, frankly, which doesn't look at climate issues. And water, of all things, has to address both mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, because some 7% of electricity on the planet is used up pumping water around. In California, it's 15% of the entire electricity generation of the state. If we can get that down with mitigation or energy efficiency measures, that helps. And of course, adaptation, because we are experiencing climate change. So that led to this breaking out of different sort of sectors: water, energy, transport. I had this conversation with an investor about 8 years ago at one of the investor conferences around, what about why railways in here? Aren't railways dirty? No, they are low carbon compared to cars, etc. So it's been a long education process out of this. Behind all of this is a sense of extreme urgency around climate. I'm assuming everyone on the call knows about the issues around climate change. You might have read the IPCC report of 2018, which essentially says we have till 2030 to cut global emissions on average by 55%, to have a reasonable chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change, not a certain chance. And in fact, given the impact of climate change in the last few years, with wildfires in Australia and California, with floods in other parts of the world, with incredible warming of the Arctic over the last 2 winters, which has pushed cold air down into North America and into Europe. And actually with the pandemic, which is about pathogens jumping between species as a result of degraded environments, as predicted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the last 30 years. They've been saying, we will have a century of pandemics. We've had already 4 close shaves this century, MERS, SARS, etc. 1 got away. We are likely to have more. These are results of our ecosystems collapsing, our biodiversity collapsing. In fact, in Asia, it looks like bat colonies have started congregating in the Golden Triangle as they're forced out of land around China and Southeast Asia. And that mixing of bat colonies has led to very fertile ground for the development of pathogens, which we now experience. So these are things that are not new and not a surprise, but when they happen, boy, it gives us a bit of a shock. We're experiencing climate impacts. Climate impacts will not be linear. They will be volatile. It will be a jagged line as we go through, which of course means the adaptation agenda is also very big. But the time scale is mildly terrifying. A moment of reflection here before I get onto the taxonomy. Someone asked me recently, am I optimistic? And I said, it's the human condition to be optimistic. I'm definitely hopeful, but it's not borne out by the science. The science is very pessimistic, is not going our way. We had emissions reductions in 2020, but something like 8% reduction. Well, according to the IPCC, we have to average 8% year in, year out till 2030 globally. We need a pandemic every year, in other words, to be able to avoid catastrophic climate change. And even then, I'm not so sure anymore. The warming in the Arctic and the release of clathrates has started. We've seen a few years ago, kilometre-wide plumes of methane bubbling out of the Barents Sea. We've seen permafrost collapses across Russia and the opening up of sinkholes as methane leaks from the unfrozen permafrost. This release of methane from the Arctic, if it follows through as scientists think it might, would be game over for the planet, for humans, I should say, because it would be impossible to wind back from. It's called a feedback loop. There are a series of feedback loop in climate science that, as they start cutting in, eventually lead us, or basically lead us quite quickly to what's called runaway climate change. So if we miss the 1.5, the 2 degree target, that is maintaining temperatures at that level, we don't just inch up to 3 or 4, we run away to 6 or 7 or 8 degrees average warming, which is, by the way, about 50% higher over land on average, because the seas are a bit cooler. And greenhouse gas or CO2 equivalent particles in the atmosphere shoot up from about 420 today to 1,000 by the end of the century. We don't know whether humans can survive in that. In fact, humans have never been alive with the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere today. This is new for us in history. 1,000, well, we don't know whether humans can survive. What we do know, ironically, is that our brain functions slow down. You know, if you've ever been in that situation of being in a meeting room all afternoon with the air conditioning failing and the windows closed and the room gets very, very stultifying, well, that's 1,000 ppm. That's what the whole atmosphere of the planet would be like. Humans become stupider, if that's possible. So it's a very unfortunate thing to look forward to. I remain hopeful because of 3 things. One is the solutions are here. There's no rocket science. People talk about R&D, but actually R&D is icing on the cake. Most of the solutions are eminently deployable today. And it's hard to find things from a technological point of view you can't just do right now. Sure, R&D will help with cost reductions, like a direct air capture. The second thing is that this requires vast capex, vast capital expenditure. Some $5 to $7 trillion a year needs to be going towards green investments. It's currently, I would say, about $1 trillion a year. So it's a significant scaling up. Some of that is just repurposing. So, you know, water investments need to be recalibrated to address emissions and adaptation, for example. The good news is we have the capital. We have a world afloat in capital. Speak up. I mean, 26% of institutional investment in Europe is in negative or zero interest rate bonds of various sorts. German bonds, Swiss bonds, Swedish bonds all pay negative interest rates. Like, we pay them to look after our money. So you can see that, well, first, that's no way to pay our pensions. That money could be redeployed, potentially, into things that have a little bit of interest, a bit of a return. Capital costs are as low as they've been in modern history, if not lower than they've been in modern history. And at the same time, we're faced with the challenge of rebuilding the world economy as a green economy. We're lucky. We're lucky on that front. That gives me hope. We simply need to do the deals, of course, and to direct capital accordingly, hence the taxonomy that I'll come to in a minute. And then the last thing is, I do see some technologies like the air capture coming through. I see forestry coming through, and I see the pandemic as giving us hope, because it showed, despite the brutality of the year for those of us that lost loved ones, for our economies and so on, it showed that faced with a crisis, it is possible to act. The tools are available to us. It was a wake-up moment, an enlightening moment. And that gives me hope, if we can maintain the sense of urgency. If we can't maintain the sense of urgency, you know, humans aren't very good at this. We easily get distracted by a game or something like that. If we lose the sense of urgency, we might not make it. And when I say might not make it, I think we are looking. When I speak to senior climate scientists I know, they turn around to me and they say, I don't think my grandchildren are going to have much of a future. They think that we are likely to lose a third to half the world's population. In fact, we did recently, in the 1600s, we had 2 degrees global cooling. We now know with a fair degree of certainty that that was as a result of depopulation of the Americas in the 1500s by germ warfare, smallpox and measles. We wiped out whole civilizations that were only now discovering, and the LiDAR photography in the jungle of the Amazon existed there. We depopulated the Americas by some 95% in that 100 years. The forest regrowth, this is a slightly hopeful point in a way, the forest regrowth was so extraordinary that we sucked so much carbon out of the atmosphere that we cooled the world by 1.5 or so or more degrees. And we created feedback loops for that, because we now know that increased rainfall over volcanoes sets off volcanic activities. There's been some science out of Mauna Loa recently about this. And we saw 2 or 3 major volcanic eruptions during the 1600s that led to the equivalent of nuclear winters, 2 years without crops and so on. So this was a tough century. The century of the 30 Years' War in Germany that saw half the German population die during that 30 Years' War. Extraordinary. Plague around the world, in China and in Europe. Famine all around the world. And of course, a century of crop failures and so on. So we now believe that we lost a third of the world's population in the 1600s, which is pretty extraordinary, really, isn't it? And I wasn't taught that in my history books when I was a kid. But there's a fantastic book by a Cambridge historian called Geoffrey Parker on the global climate crisis in 1600, which just lays all this out. And then the research on the collapse of the population in the Americas and the subsequent regrowth of forests is done by a bunch of Stanford University researchers in the last few years. This is all relatively new science. It's amazing how much we have to learn. The forest part I like, because we could drastically increase our forest cover. In many places in Europe, we are farming unsustainably. It would be better to turn that farmland back to forest in many cases and import our food from Kenya or Brazil at a lower carbon cost, because we're not using energy to be able to heat things up in winter. You know, a tomato in London, I buy tomatoes from the Netherlands because that's what's in sale in the supermarket. But I know that they have a higher carbon footprint than tomatoes that are flown in by 747 from Kenya because of the hothouses used in the Netherlands. These are opportunities as far as I'm concerned. They show us what we could do to address these challenges. That's why I have hope, because we keep seeing things we could do. But boy, we have to be fast about it.
Sean, just
slight diversion. Go ahead.
Yeah, there is a Niels Torres Scotland who is raising his hand, so he may, I guess, he may have a question or at least a comment.
Niels,
hi,
please.
Hi there. Calling in from Norway. Thank you so much for the presentation. But my attempt to keep you awake, I will give you a question that might cook you up a little bit. Are there any kind of operational understanding of what's unsustainable behavior behind the taxonomy of the climate bonds, or is it only the understanding of singular mistakes on innovation without actually seeing the pattern of how human beings can become a more relevant species in nature?
You ask a very deep and complex question, Niels, about our relationship to the planet and nature. No, the taxonomy does not address that, as you would expect. It's overly complicated to be able to address in a taxonomy. What we simply try to identify is investments that are consistent with getting emissions down and adapting in a relatively short time frame. Of course, I do think there is something to be worked on the topic you raise. I think our relationship to the planet, to Gaia, as James Lovelock called it, is the essential question of our times. You know, I have my views about it. I happen to think that we are effectively an experiment by Gaia. I hope everyone is familiar with the term Gaia. There's a book by James Lovelock some 40 years ago, which described the whole idea of the planet as a single organism that continues to regulate its, I suppose the real test that is, regulate its temperature despite a waxing sun. In other words, while the sun has changed the temperature, the planet has not over many tens of millions of years. And life forms are a means both of managing that temperature as well as benefiting from that stable temperature. We are just yet another life form sent along by the greater Gaia to work on managing the temperature in it, I would argue, and maintaining life. Of course, we may have messed it up badly, but we'll see how we go. I like to think that we are effectively a species taking on the role of consciousness, because the period at which Gaia is now in relation to the sun is such that things are getting a little bit serious. The warming of the sun is will in the next 100 million years threaten the existence of Earth. So we will need to be a little bit more clever about how we manage the planet, and we're an experiment in developing a higher level of consciousness that might be able to more reliably manage the temperatures of the planet. As I said, we're not doing very well so far, but if we get across this bridge, I would argue we have hope in terms of the role of humans on the planet, as well as the planet itself. If we don't get over this bridge, then I would expect that Gaia will shrug us off and move on to some other species. Perhaps cockroaches will get the go this time. I have a friend, Pavan Sukhdev, who's the president of WWF nowadays, who argues that the pandemics and the attempted pandemics, the SARS, the MERS, are essentially the planet trying to shake off the parasite. So we'll see how long that goes. So yes, there's a topic there, but let's not get away from the fact there's a whole lot of very simple things to do. So one is cut emissions, please, and fast. It's simple, right? We do that, we buy ourselves a lot of time to be able to have a good reflective conversation around a campfire at night about the meaning of the species, etc. Until we deal with these short-term problems, we just don't have time. And that was the idea, or that influenced the construction of the taxonomy. This led to a whole bunch of inquiries. The first inquiry was actually the People's Bank of China Green Finance Task Force that I was on in 2014, 2015. And that led to a bunch of recommendations. It was chaired by Dr. Ma Jun, who's at Tsinghua University now. At that time was the chief economist of the People's Bank of China. And well, to my surprise, the regulators took up the ideas. They brought in regulation around green bonds on 1st of January 2015. They brought in a Chinese taxonomy and many, many other things. In fact, the most fertile ground for innovation in this area has been the Chinese economy, where we've seen all sorts of things tried at provincial level. The government designated 5 provinces as green finance test sites. And they've done everything from guarantees to buying down of interest rates that are for green and so on. So China's taking this quite seriously, I have to say, at a central level. The fight in China is between member states in the center, not unlike the fight between the Commission and Poland, I have to say. It's very remarkably similar. In 2018, we produced the high-level expert group of financial report. I had the privilege to be a member of that. And we proposed the idea of a taxonomy, as well as the International Platform on Sustainable Finance that we'll come to later, which is Europe's attempt to bring together countries working on sustainable finance. The membership currently represents half of global GDP. The technical expert group was set up. Taxonomy regulation was adopted. When we issued the draft report of the technical expert group, we had been able to, with the help of DG FISMA, to my surprise, Ministry of Finance, maintain what we'd call a strict science-based approach. And this is a hallmark of the taxonomy. This was what we try to do at climate bonds. Now, this is different to national climate change plans or NDCs. We've done something terrible over the last 30 years. We've listened to our climate scientists tell us what we need to do, and then we've said, oh, that sounds really hard. What about we just do this? That'll be all right, hey? And we've done that in pretty well every country. And as a result, we've had climate change plans utterly inadequate to the task. They still are, frankly. The NDCs, as they're called, under the nationally determined contributions, under the UNFCCC process, the Paris Agreement process, would, if they're all implemented, and bear in mind the Pakistani one is 1 page long, so not a lot of detail, they would amount to about 4 degrees Celsius of warming, which is in the area of triggering feedback loops and runaway climate change. So 4 degrees means 8 degrees as far as I'm concerned. With the approach we've taken, we've kept to a 1.5 degrees Celsius framework, which is the ambition of the Paris Agreement. I appreciate there's a bit of fudging in the final wording. And the trajectory that was outlined in the IPCC 2018 report. And also, we've used the IEA modeling that was announced in November 2018. There's a great press story about it, but the US vetoed the release of the actual modeling. So the modeling you'll see now on the IEA website is a 2 degree scenario, which, by the way, is 2/3 the amount of carbon as 1.5 degrees. In other words, a 1.5 degree scenario is 1/3 the amount of carbon as 2 degrees. That is vast. This is vast. People don't understand that 2 degrees is not just a little bit more than 1.5. It's an entirely different paradigm with, of course, consequent risks to our world. The Commission caught up with us. Oh, what a joy that was. First, they announced the 2050 net zero target, to be followed by many other countries around the world, although I will give due credit to Theresa May in the UK. She came in ahead of one of her swan song acts, which was Prime Minister, was to pass that off. And now we have 110 countries around the world committing to 2050 net zero targets, with the US about to join. China's committed to 2060 carbon sustainability, in their words, which is an amazing change in a year and a half. When we brought out the taxonomy, many people in the Commission were shocked because this was against much policy that was being promoted by the Commission. But once Ursula von der Leyen made the commitment to a 2030 55% cut on 1999 levels, which is again the IPCC global average recommendation. In other words, Europe will need to do more actually to compensate for the fact that it's easier to do things in Europe. Things started changing at a Commission level, and now we have a wholesale review of energy policy happening in DG Energy to match the 2030 commitment, which is bringing it in line with our taxonomy recommendations. I will say we're still having fights over it. There are some member states who are very unhappy with the energy sector electricity generation recommendations and are pushing to include unabated gas and so on. I'll come to those later. It's not over yet, but the Commission so far has kept to the script, if you like, and kept to the recommendations. The Action Plan on Sustainable Finance was in 2018, the TEG report last year, and of course the Platform on Sustainable Finance launched in October, and now I'm yet again found myself a member of this group, and we're now looking at circular economy, pollution prevention, and other issues as an extension of taxonomy. So that's the background to it. It fits within a broader action plan on sustainable finance. This is what was announced in 2018. There is a version 2 coming through in the middle of the year. We expect in June, before summer, upping the ante significantly, or at least this is what I'm being told by the Commission. But out of the action plan, there are a few things that are worth noting. The taxonomy, of course, I've mentioned. The disclosure regime was quite important. So Europe has passed disclosure legislation, which means that all corporations and investors, start off just investors, will need to disclose their high carbon and their sustainable investments. And the EBA is bringing out disclosure requirements for banks. And the Commission says member states will be subject to the same disclosure requirement. Interesting to see how that goes through the Member State Council, but that's the ambition of the Commission. All underpinned by a taxonomy which provides, for the first time, frankly, in Europe, a common language of definition for what can be called sustainable, and tries to address some of the contradictions. You know, you maintain wetlands, but solar farms are important. No, you can't build a solar farm in a wetland. This is called a do no significant harm provision. So this is the core part of the changes of the action plan so far. We know what the urgency is here. I guess COVID-19 has underpinned the need to do something in many ways. The narrative in Europe has been very positive. The IMF managing director first came out and said that we have to build back better through the COVID recovery. That has been maintained as a mantra for the Commission, which is fantastic. Not always by member states, but they're getting there. So while we recover from the pandemic and create jobs as part of that, we need to ensure that we're not restarting our economy in a way that builds back the past. We need to focus on building or creating investments and activities that will be consistent with the future that we want to have. That's essentially it. Simple concept. It's got currency here. Of course, it didn't have currency under the Trump administration in the US, but it is very much a central theme of the Biden administration coming in. And in China too, where the central government has been very active in promoting green investments. The provinces haven't always been aligned with it. That's another story. Now, the second understanding goes back to the comment I made earlier about the pandemic having its roots in climate considerations. As we build resilience, we need to be thinking about resilience against future pandemics. There will be more. In other words, it's not just about recovering our economy, it's about making sure health system investments are suitable for this. Now, you know, I've saw an article today about a hospital design, which ensures that all the common areas have power points and oxygen points that can be turned into emergency wards if necessary. After the SARS virus, hospitals in central China and in Taiwan built whole spare wings of hospitals that were mothballed. And when the virus started, they could be opened up as a quick and short expansion. It wasn't enough because the disease was bigger than that, but it helped to begin with. The UK, on the other hand, had run down its hospital system, and it had 30% fewer doctors per capita than Germany did. Probably one of the reasons why Germany handled the initial wave much better than the UK. And of course, hospital beds equally. So understanding what we need to do to cope with these sorts of crises needs to become part of our planning for resilience going forward. Essentially, resilience is a lot more than coastal defenses. It's a lot more than the adaptation discussions we've been having in the past. It now has to be social, economic, health system resilience as well, which is the correct understanding, but the pandemic has driven it home. In a way, resilience can be looked at through the eyes of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I would argue are predictors of resilience. They're not necessarily adequate to the description of what to invest in. Health for All does not tell you what kind of hospitals to create, but they're a starting point of areas to focus in. And we hope to be doing more of that at the Climate Bonds Initiative this year, and also at the platform where we start having this sort of discussion. Okay, let me get you into a bit of quick detail now. Taxonomy development has gone crazy, really. We have China being the first, Europe being the second to taxonomy. We now have taxonomy projects in Colombia, Chile, South Africa, well, as of a few weeks ago in India, in ASEAN. Russia's developed a taxonomy. In fact, they have aligned it with the European taxonomy. This is a significant political win. They have removed unabated gas and supercritical coal from the taxonomy to ensure there are no speed bumps, to make it harder for Russian companies to be able to raise capital in Europe, to get around sanctions or whatever. So this is part of the example of the ripple effect of the European taxonomy and a centre of capital. This is the soft power we can have in Europe if we push this. There are taxonomies in Kazakhstan and Mongolia and all sorts of places. Who knows? Maybe there will be in the US in the next couple of years. The taxonomy is essentially a kind of shopping list or an inventory for the future, or procurement plan for the Paris Agreement, I like to say when I get into alliteration. It helps reporting, and it has a whole discourse around transition in it. In other words, it's not just identifying investments that are 2050 compliant, it's also advising, when relevant, on investments that will tighten or get tougher over time. Like the steel industry, for example, there's an emissions threshold that will eventually be zero carbon, but it's not zero carbon yet in the taxonomy. I would have liked it to be tougher myself, but hey, and so on and so on and so on. It's based on these targets, really. The 55% I mentioned to you, or rather it's now consistent with that. The targets include a third share of renewables in the mix. I hope that'll be higher, by the way, and I have every belief it will be higher, but let's just leave that for the moment. And then, of course, energy efficiency, which is a tough one. It's science-based. We keep saying this is a mantra. Now, this isn't always successful because the science always gets polluted by a political economy if you keep your eyes closed for a few seconds. But the Commission is holding the line so far. Commissioners have continued to repeat this term in public, which allows us to continue to argue against attempts to dilute it. It is dynamic, that is, it will change, especially the transition elements of it. And of course, it'll become part of level 2 EU law. The areas we've looked at so far are mitigation and adaptation. We're now looking circular economy, pollution prevention, sustainable water, and biodiversity. And we've added on 2 extra areas. Social. So we had a workshop last Friday, in fact, about the principles behind the social taxonomy. Europe has already issued social bonds, so we need to catch up with that. And also we're looking at essentially negative investments. So investments that would do harm, largely high carbon investments or high GHG investments. Used to be called the brown taxonomy, but that's not the right word to use anymore. So there's a lot happening out of the current platform. The features are, we need investments that substantially contribute to one of the key objectives. 1. At the same time, we need to make sure that they don't inadvertently harm one of the other objectives. This is getting complicated, I can tell you. The work involved in doing this is very engaging, let's say. And we've also agreed that we need to ensure there are minimum social safeguards involved in taking this forward. To give you a bit of flavour, the do no significant harm issues is essentially economic activities, or rather excluding economic activities that undermine an environmental objective. This might be, you can't do a building if you're doing it on a floodplain or you haven't taken into account adaptation. You can't build a solar farm on a wetland. You can't build a low carbon rail line to a coal mine. There are many, many things along those lines. The minimum social safeguards have essentially focused on 2 provisions. The OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises on human rights and the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights. And within that, the ILO Declaration on the Fundamental Rights of Principles of Work. Not exactly controversial, but reasonably thorough. The challenge of some of these, by the way, is getting data points to be able to show them. That's a job we're still working on, but that's the principle behind what we're doing. We've looked at activities that contribute, as I mentioned. We've also looked at activities that are transitional. So to take the building sector, in the technical expert group recommendation, we propose that people should be allowed to count as sustainable best-in-class buildings. We propose the top 15% of buildings in any one country, which should become a hard measure, an energy efficiency or emissions measure, which would then ratchet down to 0 in 2050. In other words, we would drive down the threshold over time, but allow the creation or the extension of a green market based in best in class now. So the theory of change behind that, obviously. And in each of the sectors, we've had a different discussion about what the theory of change might be and what the means of driving change might be, which has led us to occasionally different models of threshold in different sectors. Been a long discussion. We've had enabling activities. We're looking at, well, I'll give you an example, grids. We've had a remarkably generous approach to electricity grids because we've said that Europe has to electrify. In fact, the world has to electrify. Get rid of gas top cookers. It's all got to be induction, etc., etc., etc. For that reason, grid investments qualify. We've had some exclusions. No grids to a coal-fired power plant or a gas plant, obviously. But general grid investments, we're saying this shocks some of the grid companies. I had a German grid company say to me, "Are you sure about this? Our investors won't believe you. Do you mean we can issue a green bond?" Yes, and they're going ahead and issuing a green bond, by the way. And this is the way the discussion about what we need to do is influencing our understanding of what is sustainable finance, expanding horizons and limiting horizons in some areas. The European Parliament specifically requested that solid fossil fuels be excluded. They would have been excluded by the threshold is set. They just wanted an explicit exclusion. So, c'est la vie. That's added in. So when people are looking at whether they comply or not, they're looking at a number of different factors. Are they reducing pressure on the environment? Are they enabling other activities, for example? So there's a whole usability set of programs and advice that we're providing. And in fact, just today, ESMA, the European regulator, released its guidelines for application of the taxonomy, which pick up many of these sorts of issues. The areas that we dealt with in the first round of the taxonomy were electricity generation. We essentially set a threshold of 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. The Commission is continuing to back that, but this is under attack by a coalition of 11 member states at the moment. So whether it'll survive is a matter of member state negotiation. It means that solar, wind, most geothermal, not all, because some geothermal has a very high GHG footprint, and most hydro would qualify. Gas would qualify, but only if it had full carbon capture and sequestration, not viable now, plus fugitive emissions were measured across the full life cycle, which they're not. And in fact, I've just released last week a statement about, a horrifying statement about the methane emissions from the gas cycle, which is showing that in some cases, like if LNG gas plants, the methane emissions can be as high as a coal plant. The lack of consideration of the leakage factors is extraordinary. The industry has not been measuring. The industry has been relying on estimations which are now proven to be way understated. Admittedly, the leakage are very spotty. There's big leakage in different places. It's not universal, but we don't know. We don't know enough, and there's a lot of it. The whole Permian Basin in Texas leaks. Turkmenistan leaks, Russia leaks, etc. And as you may know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, 87 times more potent than CO2. So a 2 to 3% leakage means you have the same footprint as a coal-fired power station. So we're putting this out there at the moment around electricity generation. Transport, 5 years of low emissions, 0 tailpipe from 2025. That's electric or hydrogen or compressed air for that matter. So a rapid transition with a big emphasis on mass transit, of course. There are agriculture and forestry contributions, highly contested by the Finnish and Swedish forestry industry at the moment. We can talk about that if you wish. Buildings I've mentioned already. ICT, we've put out guidelines for data centers, which by the way, consume 3% of the world electricity. So getting emissions down there is very important. powered by renewables is good, as Microsoft and Apple are doing, but not everyone is. Manufacturing, transition elements, aluminium, steel, concrete, plastics, and an overarching thing about energy efficiency. In some areas in the building sector, we've put out what we call a white label, lists of activities or manufacturers that simply qualify, such as a triple glazed windows manufacturer in Milano will qualify. They don't need to prove anything more. But I want to stress that it is specific to the sector, the nature of the criteria we've used, because there is not an overarching methodology because of the heterogeneous nature of the sectors. And this is unusual compared to previous approaches. You'll still see many decarbonisation strategies that say X% decarbonisation is good. Actually, that's not true. A decarbonisation rate you have to get to if you're a gas company is way, way higher than a decarbonisation rate you have to get to if you're Telefonica or another telco company. It has to be industry specific. Behind all of this is an idea that there are different trajectories of change in different industry sectors. So look, that's basically it. It's going to qualify, it's going to involve all financial sector actors of any size in future. It will, over the next 2 years, become mandatory. There's a glide path to becoming mandatory, but many investors are already recalibrating their portfolios around the taxonomy. There's a transition component for companies. You can declare one part green. Next year, you can declare more, and the year after, you can declare more, and that allows an investor to increase their declarations as well. Of course, it influences the green bond regulation that's coming into Europe as well. I'm having a bit of trouble. Here we go. So if you're an investor, the way you declare is you aim to come up with a percentage of your portfolio that's taxonomy aligned. You look for a percentage for each company. Depending on your shareholding in that company, that will represent a different weight in your portfolio. And you aggregate all of those figures. This will be the same for banks declaring loans and so on, and member states potentially too. The platform is an advisory group. The Commission has to make the call. Sometimes they're going to make the wrong call. I've already had a few arguments with them, but it is the Commission's responsibility as the designated officials. So we can only be an advisory group at a platform. The next steps, we have in April, we will see the next draft of the taxonomy. It'll be very interesting to see whether they accepted all our recommendations going forward. Whoops. And so on and so on and so on. I won't go into this. I'll just quickly move on now to go to questions. There's a concept that we're pushing hard around transition. So with the finance sector, investment banks have been trying the idea that transition is separate to taxonomy. That, you know, that's great, the taxonomy, but the stuff that's good, but you can't quite call it Paris Agreement compliant, we'll call that transition. Like few gas plants. There's been quite a few gas-related bonds out of here. My retort to that, and our retort in the taxonomy work, is you have to have a transition to something. You can't just have a transition to nowhere, and everything needs to head towards the Paris Agreement. So make your arguments accordingly. And it's very hard to see gas plants being consistent with the science in terms of a transition. But there are many other things that are consistent. Steel investments leading to zero carbon steel, for example. So in the bond area, bringing it back to bonds that started us off on this journey, we see, let's call it a bunch of gelato flavors of bonds. There's a green flavor. There are sustainability flavors. There's certainly some blue flavors around now, water bonds and marine bonds. There are resilience bonds. EBRD's done one, different flavor of gelato. Same principle, still addressing the Paris Agreement, and there are transition bonds or investments as well. All flavors of the same piece of work, which is how we get to the low carbon and sustainable world that we need to get to. Next. The green definitions part is about making it easy. We want to commoditize, we want to make comparable, but above all, we want to make it easy for people to know what to do. There are contests here. You know, if Volkswagen produces or does a car plant and produces lower emission diesel, it's going to say, hey, I'm cutting emissions 15%. What's wrong with that? We're going to say to them is, once we look at the trajectory in transport, the change is so radical that you're going to have to leapfrog to zero carbon, which is electric or hydrogen. And you're going to have to do that by 2025, is what we said in the taxonomy, if you want to qualify as sustainable. If you invest in a reduced emissions diesel plant now, you are blocking the chance of investing in electric, which is what you've got to do. In other words, your diesel plant is counterproductive. It might reduce emissions, but not enough. This is what we're trying to do with the taxonomy, to influence decisions that are made in corporations and other institutions around capital expenditure. This will make it easy because there will now be guidelines and there will be incentives attached to it. EU-China harmonization is a key plank of this work under the umbrella of the International Panel on Sustainable Finance. We're in the middle of it. It's challenging, I'm going to say, but this year we'll produce a series of reports. Climate Bonds is advising the Commission or managing that side of the Commission. The second point, we will see a lot of incentives this year, from European Central Bank green quantitative easing to green funds set up by the Commission to invest in taxonomy compliant instruments to other sorts of regulatory support. Remember that this is where the job really has to be done. Governments need to ensure that they are doing the planning for green. Energy sector planning, urban planning, agricultural planning. How do we shift the incentives in the Common Agricultural Plan so that we can make it a carbon agricultural plan? This is the challenge for us in the near future. And then, of course, in the meantime, we have the problem of building back better. Green, resilient jobs, not the old jobs. That's our challenge going forward. There's a lot of scope for job creation. You know, when Roosevelt in the 1930s put a lot of people to work planting trees. Hey, we could do that in Europe and around the world. Just planting trees would get low-skilled labor work straight away. And then, of course, we need the training programs to shift people to different sorts of industries. My last thought for you is a green window. This year, a year of hyper competition between China and a resurgent China, the US and Europe, means that we will continue trade wars. But we have an opportunity between the three major economies to open a green window of collaboration and of open tariffs. While Valdis Dombrovskis works on carbon tariffs in Europe, we can also be working on abolishing tariffs for zero carbon steel or other sorts of produce. We should, I think we will. We will open a green window between our relative economies. That, I think, is one of the ambitions for 2021. This is all about lighting up the change we need, making it clear, putting a spotlight on what we need to do. I hope the taxonomy will do that. It is challenging, but that's because we're in the middle of crafting it. It's a bit like creating an electric car. It takes a hell of a lot of work out of the hood. But for the rest of us, we'll be getting into the car, pressing the start button and driving off. That's how the taxonomy will work once it's finally done.